is Dead.Drop. Welcome to Dead.Drop, where mysteries unravel. This is Dead.Drop. Welcome to Dead.Drop, where mysteries unravel.
You're listening to Dead.Drop, where history's darkest secrets refuse to stay buried. I'm your host, Paul Stiling. Each episode we descend into the shadows of the past, unearthing true tales of the unexplained. We follow the evidence, not the embellishments, through crumbling archives, eyewitness accounts, and the echoes left behind. So turn down the lights and listen closely. What you're about to hear cannot be unheard. It's Christmas Eve, 1945. Snow blankets the hills of Fayetteville, West Virginia. Inside a modest two-story home, the Sodder family is settling in for the night after their holiday celebrations. 10 children live in this house with their parents, George and Jennie Sodder. By morning, 5 of those children will be gone forever. At approximately 1 a.m. on Christmas Day, fire erupted through the Sodder home. George and Jennie, along with 4 of their children, escaped the blaze, but 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty, ranging in ages from 5 to 14, were never seen again. Now, you might think this is a tragic story of a house fire claiming young lives. That's certainly what authorities concluded. But here's where this case becomes something far more sinister. No remains were ever found. No bones, no teeth, no trace of 5 human beings who should have left behind evidence of their existence, even in the most intense fire. For nearly 80 years, this case has haunted investigators, amateur sleuths, and the surviving Sodder family members. Was this simply an horrific accident, or was something far more deliberate at work? Tonight we're going to examine every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every suspicious circumstance surrounding that Christmas Eve fire. Because what happened to the Soddor children isn't just a missing persons case. It might be one of the most perfectly executed kidnappings in American history. To understand what happened that night, we need to understand who the Sodders were and why someone might have targeted them. George Sodder and his wife Jennie lived in their Fayetteville home with 9 of their 10 children at the time of the fire. George was an Italian immigrant who had built a successful trucking business in the area. But George wasn't just another businessman trying to blend into small-town America. He was outspoken about his political views, particularly his criticism of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini and his vocal opposition to fascism. This wasn't casual dinner-table conversation. George Sodder was actively anti-fascist in a time when many Italian Americans felt pressured to remain silent about Mussolini's regime. He spoke out at community gatherings, criticized Mussolini's government, and made no secret of his political beliefs. In 1945, with World War II just ending and tensions still high, these weren't popular positions in every corner of America. The family was well established in Fayetteville. They owned their home outright. George's trucking business was thriving, and the children were active in the community. But success and outspokenness can make enemies, and George had reportedly received threats related to his political views. The missing children were Maurice, age 14, the oldest of the missing children and old enough to potentially resist an abduction. Martha, aged 12, described by family as responsible and mature for her age. Louis, aged 9, a quiet child who was particularly close to his siblings. Jennie, aged 8, named after her mother. She was known for her bright personality. Betty, aged 5, the youngest of the missing children, still small enough to be easily carried. These weren't infants who might have been completely consumed by fire. The oldest was a teenager, and even the youngest would have left behind dental remains or bone fragments in any normal house fire scenario. The family dynamics are important here. George and Jennie Sodder were devoted parents who maintained close supervision of their children. The house wasn't chaotic or neglectful. This was a structured household where children's whereabouts were known and accounted for. The children who survived the fire were Marion, aged 17, Sylvia, aged 13, John, aged 23, and George Jr., aged 16. One son, Joe, was serving in the military and wasn't present that night. These survivors would become crucial witnesses to the events of that Christmas Eve, and their testimony raises more questions than it answers. Let's reconstruct the events of December 24th and early December 25th, 1945, based on witness testimony and official reports. The Sodder family had spent Christmas Eve in typical fashion for the era. The children were excited about Christmas morning. There had been family time together, and by evening preparations were underway for bedtime. But several details from that evening would later become crucial to understanding what happened. The fire started around 1:30 a.m. and George and Jennie were awakened by the sound of breaking glass. But here's our first red flag. What caused that breaking glass? In a normal electrical fire or heating system malfunction, you wouldn't expect breaking glass to be the first indicator of trouble. George immediately recognized the house was on fire. George had tried to save them, breaking a window to re-enter the 2-story house and slicing a swath of his skin from his arm. Think about that for a moment. A father desperate to save his children, suffering injury in his attempts to reach them. But here's where the story takes its first suspicious turn. Sodder recalled that there was a ladder permanently leaning on the side of his house for regular maintenance, such as cleaning the gutter and fixing the roof. George's first idea was to get to the children using this ladder. But when he went to retrieve it, the ladder was gone, completely missing from its usual location. George then attempted to move his trucks closer to the house to use them as a platform to reach the second-floor windows. But both of his trucks, which had been running perfectly the day before, mysteriously wouldn't start. The engines wouldn't turn over, as if they had been sabotaged. Meanwhile, they also discovered that the telephone moved from its usual location on the night of the fire. The phone lines had been cut, preventing the family from calling for help. Let's pause here and consider what we're seeing. The ladder that could provide access to the second floor disappears. Both vehicles are mysteriously inoperable, and the telephone lines are severed. These aren't coincidences or accidents. These are the actions of someone who wanted to prevent rescue efforts and delay the arrival of emergency services. By the time firefighters arrived, after being alerted by neighbors who saw the flames, the house was fully engulfed. The fire department's response time was later criticized as unusually slow, even for a volunteer department in 1945. Here's what the surviving family members reported. They heard no screams, no calls for help, no signs of distress from the upstairs bedrooms where the 5 children had been sleeping. For anyone who has experienced a house fire, or spoken with fire survivors, this silence is deeply disturbing. Children don't die silently in fires. They wake up, they cry out, they try to escape. The fire burned hot and fast, consuming the structure completely. By dawn on Christmas Day, the Sodder home was nothing but ash and debris. And somewhere in that debris, authorities assured the family were the remains of 5 children. But George and Jennie Sodder refused to accept that explanation, and their skepticism would prove to be well-founded. What happened next is perhaps more suspicious than the fire itself. The official investigation into the deaths of 5 children was cursory at best, and at worst, it appears to have been deliberately inadequate. After the fire was put out, firemen and the police searched for the Soddor children's remains on the debris of the Sodder house, but none of the bones or any other remains of the children were found. Let me emphasize this: no remains were found. No partial remains, not fragmented bones, not dental records, nothing. Fire Chief F.J. Maurice quickly declared that the children had died in the fire and that their bodies had been completely cremated by the intense heat. But here's the problem with that theory. It was later discovered that even when flesh is burned, bone fragments are typically left behind. Modern fire science tells us that bones don't simply disappear in house fires. Even in crematoriums, which burn at much higher temperatures than house fires, bone fragments remain and must be mechanically processed. The temperature required to completely destroy human bones, particularly those of children, which are denser, would need to exceed 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit for several hours. A house fire, even one that completely destroys a structure, typically reaches temperatures between 1,000 and 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit and burns for much shorter periods. There should have been something left: teeth, bone fragments, personal effects that the children were wearing or had in their beds. According to another account, they did find a few bone fragments and internal organs, but chose not to tell the family. It has also been noted by modern fire professionals that their search was cursory at best. So either the search was so inadequate that remains were missed, or the few remains that were found were deliberately withheld from the family. The local coroner ruled the deaths accidental without conducting autopsies or extensive examination of the scene. This is particularly troubling when you consider that the disappearance of 5 children should have triggered a thorough investigation. George Sodder, unsatisfied with the official explanation, began conducting his own investigation. In 1947, Sodder tried to enlist the help of the FBI because they considered it a kidnapping, but Director Hoover stated, "Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of a local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this Bureau." This FBI response is telling. J. Edgar Hoover's Bureau was known for inserting itself into cases with far less federal jurisdiction. The fact that they refused to investigate the disappearance of 5 children suggests either bureaucratic indifference or something more deliberate. George then hired a private investigator, C.C. Tinsley. However, nothing ever came from that investigation that was not already known. The private investigator was unable to uncover evidence that local authorities either missed or ignored. In 1949, 4 years after the fire, George convinced a pathologist to conduct a more thorough search of the site. Several small bone fragments were also unearthed and determined to have been human vertebrae. But here's the crucial detail. These fragments were found in a location where the intense heat of the fire couldn't have reached them, suggesting they were planted there after the fact. The investigation, such as it was, closed with 5 children declared dead and the case marked as accidental. but the physical evidence, the suspicious circumstances, and the inadequate official response all point to something far more sinister. While local authorities seemed eager to close the case, witnesses began coming forward with accounts that challenged the official narrative. Some of these testimonies emerged immediately after the fire, while others surfaced years later, but all of them suggest that the Soddor children didn't die in that Christmas Eve blaze. The first significant witness account came from a motorist driving past the Soddor home around the time of the fire. This individual reported seeing the house in flames, but also claimed to have observed several people and vehicles in the area that seemed out of place for the middle of the night in rural West Virginia. The witness described seeing figures moving around the property before the fire department arrived, but local authorities reportedly showed little interest in pursuing this lead. More disturbing was the account of a woman who operated a hotel in Charleston, West Virginia, approximately 50 miles from Fayetteville. A woman who ran a Charleston hotel claimed to have seen children matching the description of the missing Soddor children in her establishment several days after the fire. She reported that the children appeared well cared for, but seemed subdued and were accompanied by adults who seemed anxious to avoid attention. This witness was so convinced of what she had seen that she attempted to contact authorities, but her reports were dismissed. The children, she said, had Italian features consistent with the Sodder family's background, and their ages matched the missing children. Another witness came forward years later with an account that, if true, suggests premeditation in the children's disappearance. A Fayetteville resident claimed to have overheard a conversation several weeks before the fire in which someone mentioned teaching that Italian a lesson and referenced George Sodder's anti-fascist statements. The witness reported that the conversation included veiled threats about Sodder's children. Perhaps most significantly, a man who worked in the area around the Sodder home reported seeing the missing ladder, the one George couldn't locate during the fire, hidden in the woods approximately a mile from the house. This was discovered several days after the fire, suggesting that someone had deliberately removed it to prevent rescue attempts and then discarded it once their plan was complete. There were also reports of unusual activity in the days leading up to the fire. Neighbors mentioned seeing unfamiliar vehicles parked near the Sodder property and strangers asking questions about the family's routines and schedules. One neighbor reported that a man had approached her asking about the layout of the Sodder house and specifically about the children's sleeping arrangements. In the months following the fire, there were multiple reported sightings of the children. A truck driver claimed to have seen a group of children matching their descriptions at a truck stop in Pennsylvania. The children were with adults who seemed nervous and kept the children close, preventing them from interacting with other people at the stop. A family traveling through Ohio reported seeing children they believed to be the Soddor children at a rest area. When they approached to get a better look, the adults with the children quickly moved them away and left the area. Most compelling was a series of sightings in Florida, where witnesses reported seeing children who matched the Soddor children's descriptions living with a family that had no clear connection to the area and seemed to have appeared suddenly in the community. These witnesses had no reason to fabricate their accounts. They weren't seeking attention or compensation. Most were reluctant to come forward at all, given the dismissive response from authorities. Yet their testimonies create a pattern suggesting that the children survived the fire and were taken far from West Virginia. The consistency of these reports, children of the right ages with Italian features appearing in various locations with adults who seemed eager to avoid scrutiny, suggests something far more organized than a random crime of opportunity. The disappearance of the Soddor children divided the community of Fayetteville and surrounding areas. While authorities maintained their position that the children died in an accidental fire, many local residents developed their own theories about what really happened that Christmas Eve. The most prevalent theory among townspeople involved George Sodder's outspoken political views. In post-war America, particularly in communities with significant Italian-American populations, there were often tensions between those who had supported Mussolini's regime and those who had opposed it. George's vocal anti-fascist stance had reportedly angered some community members who felt he was betraying his Italian heritage. Local residents whispered about threats that George had received in the months leading up to the fire. These weren't vague warnings. According to community members, George had been specifically told that his children would pay the price for his political positions. Some townspeople believed that Italian-American organized crime figures, possibly with connections to pro-fascist elements, had orchestrated the kidnapping as retaliation. Another theory that gained traction locally focused on George's business success. His trucking company was thriving, and in a small town struggling economically after the war, success could breed resentment. Some residents speculated that business rivals or individuals jealous of the Sodder family's prosperity had targeted them, using the children as leverage to force George out of the area or destroy his livelihood. The inadequate investigation itself became a source of speculation. Many townspeople found it suspicious that local authorities seemed so eager to close the case without thoroughly examining the scene or pursuing leads. This led to theories about corruption within local government or law enforcement, possibly involving payoffs or threats to ensure the case remained unsolved. Some residents noted the timing of the fire, Christmas Eve, when emergency services would be operating with skeleton crews and response times would be slower. They believed this suggested careful planning and knowledge of the local emergency procedures. There was also significant discussion about the physical evidence, or lack thereof. Local residents who had experience with fires, including volunteer firefighters and farmers who had dealt with barn fires, expressed skepticism about the complete absence of remains. They pointed out that even in the most destructive fires they had witnessed, some evidence of human presence remained. The behavior of certain community members after the fire also fueled speculation. Some residents noted that individuals who had previously been hostile towards George Sodder seemed unusually satisfied or relieved after the children's disappearance, as if a problem had been solved. However, not everyone in the community believed in conspiracy theories. Some residents, particularly those with connections to local law enforcement or government, maintained that the fire was indeed accidental and that the children's bodies had been completely destroyed. They argued that the family's grief was causing them to see sinister motives where none existed. This division in community opinion created lasting tensions. Families split over their beliefs about what happened, and the case became a source of ongoing conflict in local social circles. Some residents felt pressure to publicly support the official explanation while privately harboring doubts. The silence of potential witnesses also became a topic of community discussion. Several residents noted that people who might have seen something suspicious seemed reluctant to come forward, suggesting either fear of retaliation or knowledge that authorities weren't interested in hearing contradictory evidence. Looking at the Soddor Children case through the lens of modern forensic science and criminal investigation techniques reveals just how inadequate the original inquiry was and how many red flags were ignored. Let's start with the fire itself. Modern fire investigation would have immediately focused on the origin and cause of the blaze. The breaking glass that awakened the family should have been a priority for investigation. Glass doesn't break spontaneously in early stages of most accidental fires. This suggests either an accelerant was used or the fire was started by external means, such as an incendiary device thrown through a window. The missing ladder represents what we would now call evidence of premeditation. This wasn't a tool that could have been accidentally displaced. It was deliberately removed from its position against the house and hidden. In modern investigation, this would immediately shift the case from accidental to intentional, triggering a comprehensive criminal investigation. The disabled vehicles are equally significant. 2 trucks that had been operational the day before, both failing to start during the emergency, stretches credibility beyond reasonable limits. Modern investigators would have immediately examined these vehicles for evidence of sabotage. Sugar in the gas tanks, disabled batteries, cut wires. The fact that this wasn't done in 1945 represents a massive investigative failure. The severed phone lines are perhaps the most damning evidence of premeditation. Telephone lines don't cut themselves, and they weren't damaged by the fire. Someone deliberately isolated the Sodder family, preventing them from calling for help and ensuring that rescue efforts would be delayed. From a forensic anthropology perspective, the absence of human remains is virtually impossible to explain if 5 children died in that fire. Modern bone analysis techniques have shown that even in the most intense fires, skeletal material survives. Teeth, in particular, are extremely resistant to fire damage and would almost certainly have been recoverable. The bone fragments that were eventually found raised their own questions. Modern forensic examination would have included detailed analysis of these fragments, determining age, sex, and whether they were consistent with the missing children. The fact that these fragments were found in areas that wouldn't have experienced the most intense heat suggests they were planted evidence, possibly from a morgue or medical facility. DNA analysis, of course, wasn't available in 1945. But modern investigators would have requested exhumation and testing of any remains that were claimed to belong to the children. The Sodder family's refusal to accept the official explanation means these tests were never conducted on whatever evidence may have existed. The pattern of witness sightings is consistent with modern understanding of child trafficking and kidnapping operations. The children were reportedly seen in different locations, always with adults who seemed eager to avoid attention and always in circumstances that prevented extended observation or interaction. This suggests a coordinated effort to move the children far from their home area while maintaining control over them. Modern psychological profiling would have focused on individuals with both the motivation and capability to execute such a complex operation. The crime required knowledge of the family's routines and home layout, access to the property to remove the ladder and sabotage the vehicles, capability to silence 5 children without alerting the rest of the family, resources to transport and hide the children, ongoing ability to maintain control over the children for years. This profile points to organized crime involvement rather than a crime of passion or opportunity. The investigative response itself would be considered criminally negligent by modern standards. The failure to secure the scene, the cursory search for remains, the dismissal of witness testimony, and the rush to close the case all represent fundamental failures of law enforcement duty. One of the most haunting aspects of the Soddor Children case is the question that keeps investigators awake at night. If these children were kidnapped and survived, how are they kept silent for decades? How do you control 5 children aged 5 to 14 for years without them escaping, contacting family, or revealing their true identities? Modern psychology and criminology provide disturbing but credible answers to these questions, and understanding these methods helps explain why the Soddor children might never have been able to return home or reveal what happened to them. First, consider the ages of the children. Betty, at just 5 years old, would have been particularly vulnerable to psychological manipulation. Young children can be convinced that their memories are false, that their previous life was a dream, or that their kidnappers are their real family. With consistent reinforcement over months and years, a 5-year-old could genuinely forget her original identity. Child psychologists have documented cases where kidnapped children, especially those taken at very young ages, develop what's known as trauma bonding with their captors. The kidnappers become their source of safety and security, and the children learn that survival depends on compliance and loyalty. This psychological conditioning can be so powerful that even when presented with opportunities to escape, victims choose to stay with their captors. The older children, Maurice at 14, Martha at 12, Louis at 9 and Jennie at 8, would have required different control methods. Physical intimidation would have been one component, but more sophisticated psychological manipulation would have been necessary. Isolation is a powerful tool. If the children were separated from each other and placed with different families in different locations, each child would have lost their support system. Without siblings to confirm their memories or validate their experiences, each child might have begun to doubt their own recollections of their previous life. The creation of new identities would have been crucial. In 1945, documentation requirements were far less stringent than today. Birth certificates could be forged, school records could be fabricated, and children could be enrolled in new schools with fabricated histories. If the children were told that their previous family had died, that they were now orphans being cared for by generous adoptive families, they might have accepted these new identities as necessary for survival. Religious or cultural indoctrination could have played a role. If the children were placed with families who convinced them that their father's anti-fascist political views were evil or dangerous, they might have been taught that they were being saved from a harmful situation. Children are particularly susceptible to moral frameworks presented by authority figures, especially those frameworks are reinforced consistently over time. The threat of harm to surviving family members is another powerful control mechanism. The children could have been told that any attempt to contact their original family or reveal their true identities would result in harm to their parents or siblings who survived the fire. This kind of psychological leverage can maintain control for decades. Consider also the practical aspects of maintaining control. If the children were moved frequently during the early years, never staying in one location long enough to form lasting relationships or attract attention, they would have remained isolated and dependent on their captors. Each move would have reinforced their powerlessness and their dependence on the people controlling them. Language barriers might have been used too. If the children were placed in communities where English wasn't the primary language, or where they were forced to communicate only in Italian, their ability to seek help or explain their situation to outsiders would have been severely limited. The normalization of their situation over time cannot be underestimated. What begins as obvious captivity can gradually transform into what feels like normal family life, especially for children who have limited reference points for comparison. After several years, the children might have genuinely believed their new lives were their real lives, and their memories of the Sodder family might have seemed like distant, uncertain dreams. Stockholm Syndrome, where captives develop positive feelings towards their captors, could have played a role, particularly if the children were treated well by their new families. If they were provided with food, shelter, education, and even affection, they might have developed genuine loyalty to the people who controlled them. The shame and fear associated with their situation would have grown stronger over time. As the children became adults, they might have felt complicit in their own disappearance or feared that revealing the truth would bring legal consequences or social ostracism. The longer they remained silent, the more difficult it would have become to break that silence. This psychological analysis doesn't just explain how the children could have been controlled, it also explains why, even if some of them are still alive today, they might never come forward. The psychological conditioning that kept them silent as children might continue to influence them as elderly adults. Nearly 8 decades after the Soddor children disappeared, investigators, researchers, and amateur sleuths continue to examine this case, developing new theories and uncovering additional evidence that authorities ignored or dismissed. The organized crime theory has gained the most credibility among modern researchers. This theory suggests that George Sodder's anti-fascist political stance made him a target of Italian-American organized crime figures who maintained loyalty to Mussolini's regime even after World War II ended. The sophisticated nature of the operation, the simultaneous sabotage of multiple escape routes, the successful removal of 5 children without detection, and the ongoing ability to hide them suggests resources and expertise beyond. Supporting this theory is the pattern of intimidation that George Sodder reportedly experienced before the fire. Organized crime operations often begin with warnings and escalate to action when those warnings are ignored. The timing of the crime, the professional execution, and the subsequent silence surrounding the case all align with organized crime mythology. A related but distinct theory focuses on human trafficking networks that were known to operate in the post-war period. Children, particularly those from families that might not receive adequate police attention due to ethnic or political bias, were valuable commodities for trafficking operations. The Soddor children, with their Italian features and family background, might have been specifically targeted for trafficking to other Italian-American communities where they could blend in. This theory is supported by the multiple witness sightings of the children in various states, always in circumstances suggesting they were being controlled and moved by adults. The consistent reports of children who appeared well cared for but subdued suggest they were being maintained as valuable assets rather than harmed. Some modern researchers have explored the possibility of an adoption scam, where the children were taken and provided to families who believed they were legitimately adopting orphans. In the 1940s, adoption procedures were less regulated and unscrupulous operators could exploit the system. However, this theory doesn't adequately explain the elaborate setup involving the fire and sabotage. The government conspiracy theory, while less supported by evidence, suggests that George Sodder's political activities brought him to the attention of federal authorities who were monitoring Italian-American communities for subversive activities. Proponents of this theory point to the FBI's refusal to investigate and the local authorities' eagerness to close the case as evidence of a cover-up. Modern genealogy research and DNA techniques have opened new avenues for investigation. Researchers have attempted to trace descendants of families in areas where the children were reportedly sighted, looking for individuals whose family histories begin suddenly around 1945-1946. While this approach hasn't yielded definitive results, it has identified several potential leads that warrant further investigation. Internet-based research communities have collaborated to digitize and analyze historical records, photographs, and witness accounts. These efforts have uncovered additional documentation that wasn't available to earlier investigators, including business records that might show connections between various parties involved in the case. The case has also been featured in numerous television documentaries and true crime programs, each bringing new attention and sometimes new witnesses. Several individuals have come forward with family stories or deathbed confessions that provide additional pieces of the puzzle, though none have provided definitive proof of what happened to the children. Most recently, advanced archaeology techniques have been proposed for re-examining the site of the original fire. Ground-penetrating radar and soil analysis might reveal evidence that was missed during the original cursory search, though the passage of time and subsequent development of the property would complicate such efforts. After examining 8 decades of evidence, witness testimony, and investigation, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. The Soddor children did not die in that Christmas Eve fire. The physical evidence is simply incompatible with the official explanation. 5 children cannot vanish completely in a house fire without leaving any trace. The absence of bone fragments, teeth, or personal effects defies everything we know about fire science and forensic anthropology. The circumstantial evidence points overwhelmingly to a planned abduction. The missing ladder, the disabled vehicles, the severed telephone lines, these weren't coincidences or accidents. They were deliberate actions taken by someone who wanted to prevent rescue efforts and ensure the fire would destroy the house completely. The witness testimonies, while not individually conclusive, create a pattern that's impossible to ignore. Multiple sightings of children matching the Soddor children's descriptions, always in circumstances suggesting they were being controlled and hidden, indicate that they survived and were taken far from West Virginia. The investigative response was either grossly incompetent or deliberately inadequate. The failure to secure the scene, the cursory search for remains, the dismissal of witness testimony, and the rush to close the case all suggest that someone wanted this investigation to end quickly and quietly. So what really happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty Sodder? The most likely scenario is that they were kidnapped by an organized group, possibly connected to Italian-American organized crime, possibly a human trafficking network, as retaliation for their father's political views or as part of a broader criminal enterprise. The fire was set as a distraction and cover story designed to make the children's disappearance appear to be an accident. The children were likely taken from their beds before the fire started, which explains why no sounds of distress were heard from upstairs. They were probably moved quickly away from the area and then gradually relocated to communities where they could be integrated into new families or identities. The local authorities either were compromised by corruption, intimidated into silence, or simply overwhelmed by a crime that exceeded their investigative capabilities. The FBI's refusal to investigate suggests either bureaucratic indifference or active obstruction. The bone fragments that were later found were likely planted evidence designed to provide some physical proof of the children's deaths while avoiding the more sophisticated forensic examination that complete remains would have required. George and Jennie Sodder spent the rest of their lives believing their children had been kidnapped, and the evidence supports their conviction. They erected a billboard seeking information about their children and offering a reward, and they never stopped hoping for answers. The case remains officially unsolved, and unless someone comes forward with definitive proof, DNA evidence, deathbed confessions, or documentation that was hidden for decades, it's likely to remain that way. But the evidence we have tells a clear story. The Soddor children were victims of a carefully planned crime that was covered up by inadequate investigation and official indifference. Their story serves as a reminder that when authorities rush to convenient conclusions, when investigations are cursory rather than thorough, and when witness testimony is dismissed rather than examined, justice is denied, not just to the victims, but to everyone who depends on law enforcement to protect them. The Soddor Children case demonstrates how crucial public attention can be in keeping cold cases alive and potentially solvable. While nearly 8 decades have passed, there's still a possibility that someone, somewhere, has information that could finally provide answers. If you're listening to this and you have family stories about children who suddenly appeared in your family around 1945 or 1946, particularly children with Italian features who would now be in their 80s, that information could be significant. If you know of deathbed confessions, family secrets, or old documents that might relate to this case, those details matter. I'd like to hear your theories about what happened to the Soddor children. Do you believe they were kidnapped as retaliation for their father's political views? Do you think organized crime was involved? Could this have been part of a human trafficking operation? Or do you have a different theory entirely? Send your thoughts, theories, and any information you might have to Dead.Drop@gmail.com. You can also leave comments on this podcast or on our social media channels. Remember, cold cases are only truly cold when people stop talking about them. By sharing these stories, by keeping the memory of victims alive, and by continuing to ask questions that authorities stopped asking, we honor the missing and the disappeared. The Soddor children deserve better than the investigation they received. They deserve better than the indifference they encountered. And they deserve to have their story told until someone, somewhere, finally provides the answers their family never received. That's today's episode of Dead.Drop. The disappearance of the Soddor children remains one of America's most compelling unsolved mysteries, and after 8 decades, we're no closer to official answers than we were in 1945. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to Dead.Drop wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review. It helps other listeners find those forgotten cases and keeps these stories alive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep investigating, and remember, the truth is always worth finding, no matter how long it takes. This has been Dead.Drop. I'm Paul Stiling, and we'll see you next week.
You listen to Dead.Drop, mysteries revealed.